Hello students, so let's catch up a little bit here and talk about what's going on in Mexico in the 1920s and 1930s. We're first going to get into the economic reforms that we see in Mexico following the Mexican Revolution. And then we're going to talk about something that went beyond our reading that we'll introduce in class on Thursday and Friday block, something called Mexican repatriation. Hopefully we'll also get the time to get through the experience of Mexican Americans and Mexicans, for that matter, in World War II. So we'll both talk about what's going on in Mexico and also what's going on in the United States for Mexicans who decided to leave and either immigrate or migrate to the United States. That will probably come in a future video. The reading that is tied to this lecture is the choices reading, pages 17 to 20. So you actually read that over the weekend. So I know that these videos are a little bit behind the reading. I hope you understand why. I talked to you about it in class, but we're catching up, we're getting there, we'll all be at the same place in the end. So here we go. I just want to pause on this slide because this is a really good question that should drive your understanding of this content, and these are the terms that you should be familiar with based on what this first video discusses. Okay, this video is actually only going to cover one slide, but as you can see here, the slide is kind of text heavy, and believe it or not, it was text heavier last year, so I actually cut way back. And I decided not to cut much more text out of this because I think it does a really good job of explaining some sort of difficult economic concepts. So I'm going to walk your way through it, and we'll just leave the video at this slide only and do another one on repatriation. Okay, so, and forgive my pronunciation, for a teacher that lives in Southern California, I really need to learn how to speak Spanish because German and French are certainly not serving my interests. Terrible joke. Okay, here we go though. The president following the Mexican Revolution, Calle, I think is how you pronounce his name, forgive me, and then following him, Lázaro Cárdenas, they actually both belong to a single party. The party does change names, which may make it a little bit more confusing for us. The party was initially called the PRN, which stands for the National Revolution Party, and then it later changed its name to the PRI, which stands for the Party of Institutionalized Revolution. But even though the party has the name revolution or revolutionary in its name, I'm going to leave it up to you to decide how revolutionary this party really was and for whom. I hope that will make sense once we get through this slide. So what's interesting is they do hold to some principles of the Mexican Revolution. One of the major ideas and values behind the PRI, at least at the beginning, was the idea that the land reform movement from the Mexican Revolution should continue and should materialize. And so the PRI did decide to launch a major land reform program. And so first, what was done is there were these major mega farms in Mexico. In a previous video, I called it agribusiness or almost corporate agriculture. I hope that makes sense. These gigantic farms that were owned oftentimes by foreign investors or also extremely wealthy individuals in Mexico. And so the land reform actually took those haciendas and broke them up into smaller parcels. And this resulted in a redistribution of almost 50 million acres of land. But what's interesting about that is despite that land reform, still millions of Mexicans found themselves landless after that reform was over. And that, I said millions. I don't know the exact number here, but I'm looking at my notes. It's literally 1/3 of all Mexicans, they received land, but still many peasants were still landless after that, partially because even though the land reform program decided to break up the haciendas, there was still quite a bit of pushback and violence between the owners of the haciendas and the peasants who worked on those haciendas. And despite that 50 million acre redistribution plan, that was not enough still to redistribute land to the 6+ million Mexicans that lost it to begin with. I'm thinking about that 6 million number. That's actually only indigenous people that lost land. That number overall was far larger. Okay, so that's one part of the reforms of the PRI. Next part is the nationalization of the oil industry. And I think that you're more comfortable with what nationalization of a resource is. We talked about it with the Suez Crisis in our previous unit, and a previous video actually did talk about it for this unit, because you might remember that that was one of the tenets of the 1917 Constitution. Okay, so this is another revolutionary idea that does manifest itself in the economic reforms of the 1920s and the 1930s. Okay, so part of this is because Mexico was an extremely oil-rich country at the time, but again, if you remember from prior to the Mexican Revolution, foreign companies still owned the vast majority of the oil reserves, the oil refineries, factories, etc. Okay, so this is a major move towards Mexican economic independence. When they nationalize the oil industry, what they're trying to do is prevent foreign wealthy investors from dictating the future of Mexico's economic development and political development, for that matter. But it might not surprise you that this is going to be a very difficult thing to pull off, and we'll get to some of the ramifications between Mexico and U.S. relations in a little while, probably not for a few days here. Okay, and then the last really interesting, in my opinion, but maybe a little bit more of a complex concept to understand, is something called import substitution and industrialization. We just shorthand call that ISI. Hopefully that's easier for you to remember. It's actually not as hard to understand as it seems. Import substitution industrialization. Think about it. To substitute imports. That's what the idea behind the program is. Okay, so because Mexico was oil rich, it was agriculture rich, they oftentimes relied on importing from other countries for additional materials. So what this program does is it tries to promote the manufacturing of as many goods as possible so that Mexico can become economically self-sufficient. If they don't need to import as many goods from abroad, that means that they will not rely on other economies for their economic livelihood. And ISI was actually very successful in Mexico and in other parts of Latin America, for that matter. And that meant that their industry grew. It actually helped raise the standard of living for many Mexican citizens. And eventually we'll see that it also was at least helpful at the time to help the economy grow. But what we will see over time in the long term is this will not be particularly good for the Mexican debt. Okay, in order to promote manufacturing, they did have to borrow heavily in order to do that. And eventually what we will learn in the future is that Mexico is going to face a serious debt crisis by the late 20th century. Okay, and speaking of late 20th century, this is a great way to wrap up this video, that this party, this single party state, does control the Mexican government until the late 20th century. So this debt crisis that we will eventually discuss will help us understand why the single party state in Mexico did not necessarily serve the interests of the population overall. And that will be a really interesting political development for Mexico in the near future. It will also help us understand why migration out of the country will continue. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. We're going to pick up with repatriation next. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned.